One, my name is Tom Axworthy. I'm Public Policy Chair at Massey College, and I'm delighted that you can join us in the first of our discussions and our ethics series. Today, we want to look at, in particular, the Indigenous perspective on sustainable development and investment. I want to begin first, though, with our land acknowledgement that Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to work on this land where Massey College is located. So it gives me great pleasure to briefly introduce our panel and then to get into the substance of our day. I want to begin with Mark Podlasly, who is a member of First Nations in British Columbia. He is the sustainable officer of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. He'll tell us more about that, but I think that's 145 or 150 First Nations as part of this major effort to look at how to have development on traditional lands. And Mark has been very instrumental in helping me attract the very distinguished colleagues who are also on our panel. Saga Williams is years of working with Indigenous peoples on resource development. She has taught also for many years at Osgood Hall in the first year program, and more recently, very excitingly, she's an advisor for the National Indigenous Law Moot Program, and so she's counseling and helping young people hone their skills in that critical endeavor, and she'll have many interesting perspectives, not only on the general issues, but on resource developments in Ontario. And Jolain Foster is a managing partner at Deloitte, uh, also years of experience in working on development issues, and along with Mark, is the co-chair of the major annual conference on First Nations investments. I believe it's in April this year in Toronto, and there's something like 1,500 delegates, 200 or 250 companies sign up to both attract Indigenous capital and to learn about Indigenous values as research projects and other projects are being planned. So that is a very major event, and we have the two co-chairs with us today. So mentioning that conference, it throws into relief the very subjects that we want to talk about today, which is that the issues of investment by First Nations in a variety of projects brings within it issues of reconciliation, environmental sustainability, economic progress, all of which are huge issues in Canada. But within those debates, I was particularly delighted to work to put together this panel because I think the economic potential of Indigenous capital and the prospects of development on traditional lands, but development with the equally strong Indigenous devotion to stewardship uh, makes this a particularly important part of the story. And I don't think that's nearly as well known as many other aspects of the environmental or economic or reconciliation debates. So I'd like to have a first round, and I'd like to turn I think first to Mark to give us his perspective and his experience on dealing with these critical issues.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for hosting us this morning. I am very pleased to be here. As Tom mentioned, I am the Chief Sustainability Officer at the First Nations Major Project Coalition, which is a national organization of 145 First Nations who've come together to pursue exactly this issue about how to become involved in projects in each of our traditional territories. And this is anything over $100 million. What we're finding at the coalition is that from our beginning 10 years ago with 11 First Nations in British Columbia, nations have come to the coalition to find the technical skills to get to the table in the negotiations on these projects. We've never advertised, and we now have 145 members. We support 12 projects with a total capital expenditure of the projects of $45 billion. And these projects are across the country. As Tom pointed out, Indigenous people across the country are starting to move into a regime now where we are being sought for our consent on projects. And not all Indigenous people are against major projects. If a project is compatible with the nation's interest in self-determination, environmental protection, cultural advancement, then a project is of interest as nations. So the coalition itself, as Tom also mentioned, puts on an annual conference every year where we provide a meeting place for companies, government, leading tribal and First Nations representatives from across North America to come together to talk about how to make these projects work better. As Tom pointed out too, the country, these questions are no longer a question of just Indigenous rights or Indigenous community engagement. They're becoming a national economic imperative. As the world is starting to move towards adopting the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, having Indigenous consent in projects is becoming a competitive advantage. Buyers, investors, consumers are starting to ask questions about where do products come from? How have they been sourced? Have they been done ethically in a way that is beneficial to all the people impacted on the ground, in the shops, in the factories? And increasingly, that means an impact on Indigenous people. Our conference, as Tom pointed out, which will be next year, April 22nd, 23rd in Toronto at the Toronto Sheraton Centre, focuses very much on the whole question about Indigenous consent as a competitive advantage, especially as Canada starts to compete for critical minerals and clean energy sources against other parts of the world. First Nations are very interested in this, and we're going to talk about some of the projects that are happening across the country right now. But what we want to just share, like to you, from our perspective, not only the coalition, but in professional realms in the country, is that Indigenous people are not a hindrance to the national economy. We are going to be, and increasingly are, a competitive advantage. And in order to get to clean minerals, transportation corridors for energy, new generation of energy, Indigenous people will have a critical say in how those projects come together, how they are approved, financed, and come to market. So with that, I'd like to pass this to my colleagues. Saga and Jolain will introduce themselves and just tell you about the projects that are happening in their regions, and then I'll share some in mine, and then we'll go back to Tom.
Good.
Saga.
Saga.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on the show today. Very pleased to be able to provide some context in terms of the work that we do. I'm based in my home community of Curve Lake, which is 2 hours outside of Toronto. I'm currently in my home in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Mississauga, my ancestors, and I'm pleased to talk about some of the interesting and very important developments that the First Nations Major Project Coalition has supported here in this province. But maybe if I step away from that for a minute, I can talk about my role within the coalition. I'm supporting external outreach to potential members across Ontario and Central Canada up until Atlantic Canada. So part of the work that I do is speak about the capacity building opportunities that the coalition provides to First Nation members, as well as talk about how we've built key partnerships. And some of those key partnerships I can definitely highlight is around critical mineral development and participation of 3 of our members in negotiations with a lithium project in Northern Ontario. It's a really important piece of work because what it does is it speaks to our ability to work with and figure out opportunities when it comes to critical mineral development. It's such an important part of getting to a net zero economy and participating in in the critical mineral supply chain process. So we're working with 3 member communities there to talk about what participation looks like on a lithium project. And we're also working on a equity agreement. So we've supported 2 of our member communities in Southern Ontario on the Chatham to Kent to Lakeshore transmission build out, which through a negotiation process and the support of the coalition, we were able to negotiate a 50% equity participation in that project and really create a platform and a threshold for communities to look at a 50% participation of equity ownership when it comes to transmission development in this province, but also across the country.
Great, thank you. And Jolain, could we turn to you quickly, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tom. And good to be here, Saga. My name is Jolain Foster. I am Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en from the northwest coast of BC. I grew up in Kispiox, a small village as part of the Gitxsan Nation, whose unceded territory is nestled kind of in the middle of the most beautiful mountains, rivers, and boreal forests. My Gitxsan name is Negwetzin, and is an ancient name, and I belong to the house of Nisto. Growing up, my siblings and I were raised by a single mother, and I witnessed extreme poverty all around me, even though my nation was rich with natural resources like forestry, water, fish, and critical minerals. And really grew up seeing corporations and government come and go, extracting and developing resources with no benefits coming back to the Gitxsan in the form of employment, procurement, or royalties. The Gitxsan Nation and our peoples experience some of Canada's highest levels of suicide, unemployment, poverty, and children in care. There are many reasons for this, a complex history between governments in my nation that continue to impact our government systems, culture, and economy. All of this ignited, the silver lining in all of this is that it ignited my passion for leading transformational change anywhere I've worked. Not just for my nation, but for all nations who share the same history of destruction. My life's purpose is working to eliminate that poverty through improved governance operations to create a new path for economic wealth for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit collectives and peoples. Today, I have the pleasure of serving as managing partner for Nation Building, a role that enables me to continue my personal journey and pave a path for Deloitte's role in truth and reconciliation. I believe this is a really great opportunity to support First Nations, Métis, and Inuit collectives and peoples in nation building, creating new pathways for economic empowerment and reinforcing self-government. I think when we talk about economic reconciliation and what that's meant for me and what I've seen specifically in the Prairies region and in British Columbia, and where I've worked most recently is in the area of oil and gas. And seeing the transformation that's happened over the last decade in kind of the desire and the want to make change with nations, and working with industry and corporations and witnessing really the efforts and the investment that is being made to reach out and engage community in a real way. to include them in and maximize their inclusion and participation in major projects has been probably the last decade of my work experience that I've been a part of, whether it's developing agreements with corporations and First Nations, operationalizing those agreements within the corporations has been a big part of my experience in the last decade. And more recently, in Deloitte, I've been leading the development of a new entity separate from Deloitte that will be First Nations, Indigenous majority owned, and will be a national entity and a limited partnership that will basically be aiming to provide services in the space of technology, and it's called Radius. Deloitte will be a minority partner to that, and we've spent the last couple of days, years. I wish it was just a couple of days, but it was the last couple of years developing this equity model to make sure that there is mutual benefit. And what is really exciting about this is we're right in the final stages of finalizing our first initial core partners and launching in the new year. And being a part of that leadership team with Roland Laboon has been really extremely rewarding because it kind of takes into consideration the experience I've had in the last decade in doing this and making sure that Deloitte does it properly and that there is going to be immediate benefit back to the nations beginning in year 1 and 2. So there's lots there. It allows for nations, for us to provide employment and a new career development with 4 nations and Indigenous peoples on and off reserve. And everything we're doing about this is really about providing a new pathway for economic empowerment for nations right off the get-go. So yeah, happy to be here and happy to be part of the discussion.
Well, thank you, and thank you all.
And-
So this is, tell me if I'm right, that this is a very major progression. If we know it's acknowledged in the Constitution that there is a duty to consult. For many years as well, there's been lots of work going on benefit agreements, but those are important advancements from certainly preceding generations. But in those cases, the corporate entities still made the decisions on what they would consult about and what benefits would be given. You're all talking about something quite different, a major change going forward on enhancement, ownership, equity. I mean, that's a major step, is it not?
Yes, it is. The big change that's happened, and you're right, it has been about consultation, duty to consult. But with the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there's a clause in there, concept of free, prior, informed consent. So
Yes.
consultation is moving into consent, and that's the big change. So Indigenous nations, it's no longer enough to go in and inform Indigenous nations what the plans the company may have or government may have. Consent is required. Now, this is still being worked out in terms of what does consent mean? Is it consent 100%? What do you do in situations where you have a linear project and you have some of the nations consenting and others not? But the change now is that Indigenous people have much more of a hand at the table to become involved. And what you're seeing now from the projects we've talked about is there's a desire to be economically involved. It's not a matter enough to have the trinkets and the agreements that say, okay, we've consulted with you, we'll proceed. No, it's right at the beginning now in the discussions. And that's the big difference.
Yeah, I would also add to that too, and I think Jolain, you spoke a little bit about this in terms of there is a desire for our communities, both from within and also external pressures, to say that we need the capacity and we need the ability to pick up these conversations and opportunities that come knocking on our door and our traditional territory, and understand how we interact with those opportunities, how we interact with the resource development projects, and what values that we want to bring to those conversations and those relationships. And I would say, for the most part, what we're hearing from our members is those values are about protecting the environment, about addressing climate change, but also about bringing a sense of economic health and well-being to our communities. So we're managing wealth, we're not managing poverty, and we're not managing the issues that come with being impoverished, and the crises that we can often face from as an internal government on a day-to-day basis. We're looking at a more strategic approach to community health, and feeding that community health from a holistic perspective, which includes economic health and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd like to add to this is that I think what I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, during and after COVID, especially, and the discovery of the unmarked graves, I've seen a major shift of recent. And I think a big part of this is having people like Mark and Saga, Nilo, and others, and advocates such as First Nations Major Project Coalition, who are able to really translate in both worlds, and really advocate on behalf of our rights and titles, and really get us into the right circles to have these discussions and to bring the right capacity to those circles with very clear messaging and leadership and vision on how we want to move forward. I think that's extremely important, that we have this type of advocacy. And yeah, I'm really, really extremely proud of First Nations Major Project Coalition and what they're doing and what they're leading, with respect to, building those relationships, building alignment between nations, and really focusing on the shared values and the shared priorities that we want to continue to push forward on. So yeah, it's very exciting. I've seen it happening and progress over the last decade, but I think after COVID and with the discovery of the unmarked deaths, it really has taken off in Canada to change for in a really positive way, and in getting our voices heard, and more importantly, us being prepared to speak to these issues. It's really changed in that way too.
Well, the looking at recent history in terms of the issue of investment per se, I think a couple of years ago, the Micmacs bought Clearwater Foods. Enbridge last year, if I'm right, had some assist from Indigenous investment program in Alberta, and purchased some equity stake in Northern Pipelines in Alberta. I think 10 or 11%.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Saga, you mentioned in your first discussion that you were working on a 50% project. Now, I'm just interested in to have the ownership back up the values that we've just been talking about. Is a 10% stake enough? Do you need 30? Do you go for 50? I mean, which the Micmacs obviously did, I think. So it may be early days, but is there a threshold in investments that you think, and our colleagues think, are required to have the kind of clout that you've all been talking about?
I think what's the important conversation here is understanding where communities want to see themselves in projects. And when you're talking about an equity stake in projects, you're talking about bringing those resources to the table as well. So what are the community's comforts around the risks that they're willing to associate in terms of that type of investment? And is it one project where they want to put in 10%? Is it another that they want to put in 10% as well? So I think depending on their investment portfolio, where do they want to see themselves, and how do they want to manage that? So I think you set the platform in terms of transmission being 50%, and there's going to be a lot of transmission development here in Ontario. That's going to be one of the key pieces to continuing to electrify this province. And that's going to provide opportunities for a number of First Nations. Mark mentioned linear projects, and that's going to bring and build partnerships amongst communities in terms of looking at finding those resources to be able to invest in a 50% ownership of transmission development. And that, I think, is just in terms of that type of development. That's just setting a platform. There might be opportunities, and I know across the province, there are a couple of opportunities where communities are owning 100% of the transmission development. And that's key in terms of electrifying and providing clean and accessible resources to communities in the north in terms of their isolation and their reliance currently on diesel. So these things run hand in hand, and I think it's part of the work of the coalition is supporting communities and finding the resources to be able to invest at the level of comfort that they're willing to seek out.
So
Tom, I just want to jump in there as well. One thing to bring up here is that Saga has pushed it very clearly. This is co-investing. This is not Indigenous people expecting to be given grants of these companies or grants on the equity share. It's co-investing, and that's the big difference. This is where it goes back to what I said at the beginning, is that we do not see ourselves as a charity case. We see ourselves as integral to the Canadian economy, integral to the value extraction that has been happening in our lands. So this avenue of investing is the big difference. Going forward, the biggest challenge nations have in this country is finding affordably priced capital. Because as you pointed out, these projects are in the billions of dollars. The Enbridge investment was a $1.1 billion investment, and that has to come from somewhere. So nations are working very diligently to find ways to get around the restrictions we have on capital. For your audiences, First Nations in this country, we have lands, but we don't own them. They're held in trust by the Crown. So you can't use them as collateral like any other company or their business. So we have to be more creative, and so do companies, to get around that barrier.
Well, and if I could add to that, speaking of being creative, I think that there's lots of opportunities for our communities to collectively come together and create an investment companies or investment funds where they can choose to support one another in terms of managing their collective wealth and making that wealth generate more wealth. And we need to look at how this type of fund can support Indigenous values and build the linkages and the relationships that we traditionally had. Mark mentioned how the Indian Act has set up barriers to Indigenous ownership, First Nation ownership, and our ability to leverage our capital in order to create financial opportunities for us. And I would say that the Indian Act not only destroyed our economies, but destroyed our relationships with one another. We have to build up those relationships and build up a sense of trust amongst one another, and also role model successes. And the coalition has been instrumental in changing the dialogue from one of politics and one of divisiveness to one of a collectivity and sharing in information and successes and best practices that lead to economic wealth and a great participation in economic reconciliation.
Yeah, such important points. I think the only thing I want to add to that is that more than ever, and I mean, going back to your question, Tom, about whether or not it has to be 50% or 10%, what is the answer? Well, I think that more and more of what I'm seeing recently is that nations are becoming much more sophisticated in developing their own business strategies. And that is so crucial to what we're trying to do with respect to participating in these equity opportunities, is understanding, what we are not going to do and what we're open to with respect to whether we're going to invest in passive equity partnerships and investments, or that we want to be full partners and be a part of decision making and so forth. And there is no right or wrong answer. It's really about what each individual nation and corporation is, what their vision is, and what their priorities are, and how they're going to execute that. It's going to be so crucial for us, nation by nation, to be able to speak clearly to how we want to grow our economy, and to have those strategies in place to make sure to do it in a way that represents who we are going forward.
Well, on Mark raised the issue of access to capital, and of course that doesn't apply only to Indigenous investors. There are groups across the country who are saying we need access to capital, but very important point, obviously, that the Indian Act itself is a major impediment for First Nations to have the base that other groups have in terms of getting debt financing and so on to move forward. And we're potentially talking about massive amounts of capital, which may be on the market. I mean, if the federal government, which it says it is going to do, is going to sell its investment in Trans Mountain, which has ballooned up to 30 billion or so, those are major divestments. And I wonder, is there a way, without getting rid of the Indian Act itself, which that would be worth another panel on how we might do that, but that the federal government, for example, could provide loan guarantees or others to First Nations for investments to get around of the impediment that the Indian Act does, so that you could be on at least equal footing in terms of these resource projects. Do we need some solid project policies to move the impetus that we've all talked about this morning forward? Who'd like to take a crack at that?
Yes. So I'll jump in first here. I'm ready to go. Access to capital is the main challenge of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, because there's no shortage of projects. You're starting to see companies now come forward. The coalition has 145 members across the country. We've never advertised for members. These are nations who come forward and need the capacity, capital, governance, technical skill sets to get to the table, because they've generally been approached by a company who wants to do something: critical minerals, energy, manufacturing. And so that's the capital issue. So you mentioned loan guarantee programs. There are 3 provinces that have provincial loan guarantee programs. Ontario has one, so does Alberta and Saskatchewan. And what they do is exactly as you say. They allow First Nations who have projects that are viable. And just to repeat, this is not a free-for-all of cash. The project has to have a revenue stream and has to be viable. Those projects, though, are in those provinces, and there is not a federal program. The challenge with those provincial programs is they're oversubscribed. There's just too much demand in terms of all the things that are coming through, looking for capital sources. And as I mentioned earlier, this is no longer a question of just an Indigenous issues question. It's a national and a provincial economy question. Companies, if they cannot get the consent of Indigenous people on board, they cannot proceed. And if they can't proceed, that affects all of us as Canadians in terms of revenue for the country, opportunities for all Canadians in terms of employment, social services funding. It all starts to flow out of that. So yes, this is a big question. Oh, federally, you asked. Yes, we'd love to see a federal loan guarantee program. TMX is a whole federal thing that's separate from this discussion, though. But TMX crosses my traditional territory, and I didn't mention, I'm from British Columbia. I'm from the Ntlaka'pam Nation, which is near Kamloops, between Kamloops and Vancouver, in that corridor. The pipeline will cross our territory. It does cross our territory. And the question now is, there's a question, are First Nations going to be co-owners of that project because it is a federal asset. The federal government has said that they want to unload it and they want to get out of that now that it's built. But you are right. There are questions that the nations have. For example, how many nations are going to be involved? How many? What's the sharing formula between the nations? Nations are not set up as corporate structures to set up running operations this way. We were set up under the India Act, is subservient to a federal department in Ottawa. So the questions then are not only about capital, technical aspects, environmental aspects, but now the governance questions about how you do that. And then the next question is, what's the price that the government wants First Nations to purchase this thing? That's a huge question. And you're right, it's gotten expensive. What's the formula? So those are commercial negotiations that are happening right now. Well, they're not happening negotiations. What's happening is discussions about what the negotiations will look like.
Because the pipeline tolls will have to be large enough to cover the cost of the capital that is going to be acquired, and one reason why there's such interest from Emera and Enbridge and TransCanada and so on is because the cost of these projects has so ballooned that they're all in major debt issues, which is a great opportunity on the one hand if you've got the capital to scoop up some assets, but it can be as the economic viability.
At what price?
At what price?
Yes, at what price? So I'd just like to point out on behalf of a lot of our members in the coalition, not every price is okay. Not every project is okay. The ability to give consent is directly related to self-determination. And self-determination means also the right to say no. And that may be no to a project and that's not incompatible with the First Nations interests, or no to a commercial deal that is not viable. I'll let my colleagues speak to that. I'm quite passionate about the TMX project because it does cross my lines. And I'm very concerned about the price.
Ask a colleague to jump in with their perspective on that project or others.
Yeah, I mean, I always love to let Mark go first on policy because he's super passionate about it and has way more experience than me with it. But I'd like to say that, yes, obviously agree that policy definitely needs to change, especially around the access to capital for nations to participate in these projects. But I also think that policy, even within the provinces, need to be updated. You know, many of these policies were set in working with Indigenous nations, specifically First Nations, and really they're not working anymore, especially within the provinces. And we have grown so much and so quickly, especially with our relationships with corporate Canada. And it's really the policies sometimes that get in the way. And I think what all governments need to start focusing on is identifying where the barriers are and where the policies need to be updated and transformed completely. And in some areas, some of them need to be completely eliminated and redrafted with proper consultation with nations. And that's the work that hopefully Saga can lead. I'm just kidding, but
and maybe I could speak to a different sector that I'm working on specifically, and that would be the critical mineral sector.
Critical minerals, yeah.
And it's such an important development in Ontario in terms of trying to facilitate projects in a very economically constrained way. We're not seeing a lot of investment in critical minerals at this time, and companies are feeling the squeeze and trying to figure out, okay, there's a lot of work that needs to happen at the junior and exploration level in order to see fruition of production coming into play. And I know that at the coalition, we've been approached by both federal and provincial government officials to talk about what does facilitating an expedited process to access critical minerals look like, and what's the First Nations role in that process. And as a coalition, we've held a couple of roundtables to discuss what that looks like. And part of the barriers that we are feeling is from a regulatory perspective in terms of um, artificial timelines being imposed where if a First Nation or a collective of Indigenous groups want to participate and want to work and move forward with a mining project, we're finding that those regulatory constraints are really hindering that process. So even if you have FPIC and you think that that's going to facilitate moving forward, and you have the community wanting to be involved in the impact assessment process, you're still going to feel those delays. And we're part of our approach is how could we remove the barriers that have been constantly put up, and whether it's legislative barriers or whether it's policy barriers or regulatory barriers, let's have the conversation about what good looks like and emulate that. And let's figure out what participation looks like and make that the standard. And access to affordable capital is part of that conversation, and also integration of our voice and perhaps even leading the impact assessment process is going to be key to that. And we can all point to a specific area of critically mineral rich a resource that has been sitting there, and we've been talking about it for over 20 years, and we need to figure out a way to break the impasse, because um, the critical mineral development is happening internationally far faster than we can keep up with it, and we need to break those barriers. And we need to, I think, look to the U.S. to find out how they're working and how we could work together to support one another in that area.
So Saga, you've raised a very important point that beyond capital, which we've talked about, there are policies, regulations, and perspectives that also have to change to get these developments done, and to have the kind of partnerships with the Indigenous peoples that we have all been talking about. Illustratively, prior to this event, we organized at Massey a conference on the future of fresh water in Canada, and the Canada Water Act has to be refashioned. It was written in 1970 under the first Mr. Trudeau, and we raised at that conference, Massey conference, that um, there shouldn't just be consultation with Indigenous peoples, but they should do the drafting, or at a minimum, the co-drafting. Who better to co-draft on water, fresh water, than Indigenous peoples who's had that ethic that we can all learn from? But it makes a lot of sense to me. Well, it should, because we raised it. But the pickup was not spontaneous among federal officials in the room. And so I'm just wondering, in your own experience, have you found reluctance to accept the logic of the point that you've just made, that there are places where beyond consultation there should be the Indigenous take the lead in order to get things done? Are we at that prospect, or is that still another leap that has to come?
Well, I think to your point about we're feeling that constantly, that we're constantly putting forward perspectives that are like, okay, this is what we're hearing from our communities about what would facilitate resource development in this country. We've just released a critical minerals roundtable report where we talk about what FPIC looks like. And I think for most people, and I'm one of those people, FPIC was not a tangible concept. Like I'm thinking, like, well, what does free, prior, informed consent look like? And this roundtables report really struck a chord with me, because it really outlined the steps that we need, or companies need, government needs, in order to get us to a place where we're all participating and that we all have a stake in the outcome of resource development, particularly in the mining sector. We don't have all the answers in terms of what does equity partnership look like in that context, but we certainly, if we allow for the conversations to happen and the community to be brought along in those steps and in those process, you're going to achieve FPIC. And as Mark pointed out, some of these projects can't move forward because they're either, for instance, on sacred land, or there is a water body that will be affected, or a river system. And our communities aren't willing to see that type of environmental degradation happen in the context of, or at the cost of resource development happening. And we have to have room for those two perspectives to come together. And I think what we're doing through the work of the coalition is building the capacity around how communities can see themselves in projects that will move forward, and how they can see themselves bringing their communities along so that their communities are assured from an environmental perspective that these projects are sound and won't interfere in the long-term concept of community health. And when we think about the long-term concept of community health, what we're thinking about is 7 generations ahead. And for us, for our community, that's not an intangible concept. My grandmother passed away last year at 100, and she got to see her grandchildren. So myself and my sister become grandmothers. And so these are really real concepts in terms of our communities, and thinking about, I want my great grandchildren and their great grandchildren to be healthy and to have a viable environment in which our spirituality, our culture, our language, our worldviews can not only survive but thrive. And yesterday, just for instance, and I might be taking up too much time in this context, but our community was the 100th anniversary of the signing of a treaty in our community. It was one of the first modern treaties in this country where we had provincial and federal representatives there. And up until 2018, that treaty was deemed to have removed our constitutionally protected rights. And I know that Section 35 was implemented in 1982, but we fought through the court system for many, many years to have access to our resources, both our harvesting resources in terms of angling and hunting, but also our ancestral resources. There's court cases where we were deemed to not have any rights and release those rights in the context of our ancestors and our archaeologically significant artifacts. And that's devastating to a people's. There's a lot of healing and a lot of trauma that our communities need to overcome in order to have these conversations. And I feel like what the coalition does is provide the voice to allow us to speak that truth, but also empower us to speak a different truth and to look forward and have a different reality, and that reality being one of economic participation.
Can I ask and I totally understand it. It differs from nation to nation and community to community, but the process of ascertaining what the members of the First Nation believe and what the priorities are. Can someone describe for me what is the process to get at that? Is it a series of use the old phrase town hall meetings on this particular subject? Is it through the band elected councils? Is it hereditary chiefs meeting? I'm just interested. What are the mechanisms to raise these critical issues that we all just talked about have to be part of the package?
Well, I'm going to jump in here. You're right. It's different in each nation. It's different in each region. But
Yeah.
Indigenous people we're not sitting in the woods waiting for a company to come by with a proposal. There's aspirations that the community has, either in language rehabilitation or jobs for youth or rebuilding infrastructure that's in communities. Communities, and these discussions are well underway. So those communities will find their own way to get their opinion together and then voice that at the tables. So it depends. It's different in each community. And sometimes there's division in communities where people are not in agreement. Often we get approached by larger groups saying, well, you Indigenous people all have to get your act together before we can move forward. And our response to that is that, oh, is that like all the provinces get along and they all make a decision in unity? It's just the Canadian way. We work it out. And it depends on each community, each nation, each organization. And sometimes it'll be band council by band council, other times tribal councils. It'll just come from different places. But I think you're starting to see now across the country Indigenous understanding that the wealth of this country has come from our lands. And as you heard from all of us, we have managed to still maintain our interests, our values, our drive towards self-determination in spite of the Indian Act, in spite of the policies, in spite of the interprovincial battles that go on between governments. We are well understanding of who we are as each of our First Nations peoples, and we will continue to push what is best for, as Saga pointed out, the continuation of our cultures, our spirituality, our environment, and we're willing to do that in concert with Canada to ensure that we have a shared future.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And the only thing I want to add to that is that growing up within the Gitxsan Nation, that it has been severely impacted by the Indian Act with respect to how we govern and how we set priorities on behalf of the nation is very complex um, and to some degree a little bit chaotic, to be honest, because we've got the hereditary system and hereditary chiefs who have a say over their own territory on resource developments in the land. But then we've also got the Indian Act band leadership that have that basically oversee the services and programs to each village. And with that, there have been some challenges in getting shared priorities within the nation, which is really where my passion comes in supporting nations. And what I've been seeing recently with a lot of the nations that I've been developing strategy with and setting priorities with is that there is much more openness to getting community input on setting those priorities and doing needs assessments and economic impact studies with surrounding towns that we live beside and with as neighbors, and really starting to develop our own playbooks on how we want to move forward. But I agree, Tom, it's challenging, and some nations have progressed way faster in how they want to lead, how they want to set priorities, and really thinking long term, like Saga was talking about, in thinking about future generations. And I think the big challenge is in doing all of the resource development and going beyond the resource development is, how overwhelming sometimes it can be with nations. And I think so it's really important. How do we do this better? It's by working together. And it's supporting nations with the gaps in capacity in being able to draft these strategies, set the priorities, engage communities and stakeholders within those communities in setting those right priorities and figuring out a good path forward.
We're coming to the end of our time, and I do want to give some time for online questions. So I believe we have an online question. Okay, we have a couple. So let me just read it out. Is it possible to invest in self-sustainable practices amongst Indigenous communities, especially in the territories? And the explanation behind the question is, this is because there are times when it's difficult around a specific community whose concerns are valid in terms of the environment and biodiversity presentation. So the question is, what is a self-sustainable project? And particularly was asked about the territories. Who'd like to jump in there?
I'm going to refer to our website, fnmpc.ca/resources, or under the resources tab, is that there's entire volumes of information we've published for communities. They're self-help guides on everything from regulated energy systems to 101s on capital markets, questions about energy production. But one section in there is on environmental, and this whole question about what is self-sustainable in terms of policies that can be put in place from an Indigenous perspective to ensure that projects are done correctly, or at least aligned with those community values to ensure that they're sustainable, not just from an economic point of view, but certainly from an environmental. It's there. We do put that out. We are about to release another one, which will be released at our conference next April. We do a lot of work with our members to do these exact questions. What is it? What is Indigenous, and what is an Indigenous value, and how does it show up in these processes? A lot of the times in the past, for 200 years, we have not been asked. It's simply been imposed on us. But now that question is front and center. And as you start to see more development happening, or proposals for clean energy and critical minerals, it's vital that that comes forward. So my answer to that is go to our website. You'll see in there reports from Indigenous voices saying this is what sustainable means from our perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think too, we're building capacity around communities making decisions about projects that they want to own and manage, and part of that is, and I'll give a couple of examples in terms of the geothermal projects that we're supporting, and our chair, who has a geothermal project in her community, Charlene Gale from Fort Nelson, is really driven by the fact that her community, this is good for her community. This is community owned. It's based in her community, and we're hearing the same things from the East Coast. So our members, Yabopeg in Newfoundland and Labrador, they're talking about geothermal projects and supporting geothermal, like a geothermal project in their territory. And I think that these things can be defined as self-sustaining, self-owned, and certainly community will see the benefit coming out of the energy that's created from those projects.
Thank you. We have another online question from the principal of Massey College, I think. So is there a role for universities in supporting Indigenous communities? If so, what should they be doing?
This is a great question.
So,
can I answer this initially? Because it's very topical. Yesterday, I was at a sunrise ceremony, and a ceremony where the unveiling of a new college at Trent University, of which there's 3 generations of my family that were graduates. That the naming of that college is after my father. Gedegam Megazé is his Anishinaabe name. And what that speaks to is the recognition that this university is located within the traditional territory of the Mississauga in Peterborough, and that the university needs to recognize the leaders in our communities and those that are dedicating their lives to language, culture, and spirituality, and the expression of those within an academic environment. So, when we're seeing schools and universities having to rename themselves because the affiliation of their names with horrible genocidal and colonial acts against the Indigenous people in this country, we're seeing a movement where universities are recognizing the damage that's being felt by our communities, and forming a basis of reconciliation, academic reconciliation, and sharing that these are important conversations to have in terms of having the fabric of academia also include an Indigenous perspective, and that everybody should have access and be privy to the local Indigenous communities in that environment.
So the
Yeah.
online questions are coming in hot and heavy now. Can I take one more? Uh, Given the diversity of views among First Nations, how should projects move forward or not if consensus cannot be reached and there are opposing views of said projects, assuming the similar strength of claim? You began to address that, Mark, I think, in one of your comments as well. But no communities are unanimous. So what do you do if there are
No.
disagreements? Any one of our
Well,
panelists?
I would say in this as the coalition, we have 145 members. Almost all of them have a project. There are so many projects. Proceed with the ones you can, and if you can't proceed, come back to it later. Sometimes no is a valid answer, and sometimes this is not really being raised often in Canada, but sometimes nations have saved companies a lot of money from projects that were not wise just because of the way they've been laid out. So if there isn't agreement on a project, keep working at it. If it's in the interests of the Indigenous party and accommodation can be met to meet those interests, it will happen. And there are no shortage. I explained at the beginning, we have 12 projects we're supporting, $45 billion in CapEx at the moment. Those projects are now underway, at least the discussions of them. Our conferences, we have examples. I should point out the conference, April 22nd, 23rd, 2024 in Toronto. We bring the best examples we can worldwide who have found the success paths to make those projects happen. One of the big projects we had this year, which was inspirational at our conference last April, a 62 gigawatt green hydrogen production facility, largest in the world, initiated by an Australian First Nation. When complete at $100 billion Australian, it will be the largest hydrogen export facility to Japan in the world. And that was brought forward by a First Nation in partnership with partners like CWP, Macquarie's, the investment bank, and BP. So these are the type of things that are happening worldwide. It's not just in Canada. So if you can't find an agreement, keep working at it, because if it's valuable for the First Nation and it's valuable for the company and it's valuable for the country, agreement will eventually come through, providing all the pieces and interests are met. It will happen.
Okay, we're coming to the end. I want to give just one last minute to our panelists if they have one last thing that they would like to say before I wrap it up. Who'd like to take an extra minute? How about you?
No one's jumping in? Okay. I'll take a minute if you're going to take it.
I thought Mark did that.
Our conference.
Yeah, I thought Mark did that. Yes,
Our conference.
Or Jolain. If there's one last.
Okay, go ahead.
Mark did kind of a wrap-up statement. If there's anything else you'd like to add.
So one thing that is focusing attention of Indigenous people and industry and government at the moment is the clean energy transition. It will take $2 trillion of capital to make this country carbon neutral. That $2 trillion is going to require critical minerals, clean energy generation, clean energy transmission. All of that material that is required is going to come from First Nations lands, be crossed by First Nations lands. On the continent, it's $6 trillion. This is an opportunity for Canada and an economic opportunity to save our climate like nothing before. And First Nations people want to be part of that. And it focuses the attention of the market. If you can't get your permits and you can't get the projects because of Indigenous consent requirements, First Nations are willing to talk. They want to be participants in this. We want to be part of saving our common environment. So we're not a hindrance anymore. We're a competitive advantage in getting to market to collect the capital that is floating around the world to make this happen.
Well, I want to thank our excellent panel for very informative, even in some cases exciting discussion. This is a world full of distress, but the message that we have from you this morning is that there are tremendous challenges, but there is a lot of positive, good things going on, and we're ready for the next big step. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.